So let's look at it from the other end now. Government debt, governments around the world, including ours, federal and provincial, went dramatically further and quickly into significant public debt. And so I'd like to get your views about whether our government's holding that extent of suddenly increased levels of debt is a problem, and what sort of problem is it? In our Rebuild Canada series, as Ed mentioned, had a number of papers, two in particular, by very impressive economists of different generations. One of your predecessors at the bank, David Dodge, argued that we have a couple of deficit problems, and the current account deficit, Canada's, in effect, our balance sheet with the rest of the world, has been problematic for some time and has now become dramatically worse because of the pileup of debt and because of other structural issues. And over time, if interest rates at some point do rise, he argues, the conditions could combine for a return to the 1990s fiscal and monetary squeeze, when, of course, he was the Deputy Minister of Finance, and dramatic spending cuts were necessary in the federal government. Another paper by Frances Donald, chief economist at Manulife, argued slightly differently. Well, more than slightly. She said that Canada does have some runway, some time to pursue a middle course between austerity and unrestrained spending for a middle ground, particularly if continued spending contributes to productivity. Interest rates are likely, very likely, to stay very low, and that gives us breathing space, and there's no reason to panic.
Right.
Where do you come down on how Canadians should be thinking about the suddenly changed public debt situation?
Well, that's of course a lot to think about, but and I think but I'm going to add one more thing, which is that it's hard for people to visualize the counterfactual. And you alluded to this in your earlier question. Well, what would have happened if we hadn't done all those things? And what would be happening today if we didn't have this big expansion in government debt? And I think the answer, of course, as I said, hard to visualize a counterfactual, but I think we can visualize something that would look a lot like, another Great Depression. Okay, so a very major crater has opened up in front of us. It's as if a major bomb has gone off in our economy. The crater's in front of us, and option one was to do almost nothing, which is more or less what happened in the early 1930s. And so we would need to walk down into that crater and walk along the bottom of it and then walk up the other side. And it could take many years to do. But instead, we've chosen to fill that crater up with liquidity. Liquidity is a really good metaphor now because that allows us to row our boat across the crater. And when we feel the bottom scraping on the far shore, then we can get out of the boat, and then we can drain the liquidity out of that pool. And with good policies and a great private sector, we'll establish a growth trend then, which will be faster growth than the rate of interest. I agree with Frances Donald on that. So that debt service can be smaller relative to growing revenues, and that we can thereby eat into that debt that we've created through this process. Fact that every country is in a similar situation kind of takes away some of the arguments about us being better than somebody else or worse than somebody else. I think the way the Canadian dollar has behaved through all this suggests that investors still regard us as a good place to be. Otherwise I think it would have gone down more because of the tumultuous situation we've been going through. So all to say, I too believe that we can work our way through this, but we need to be astute with the money. If we think of government spending versus government investment, if I may make that distinction, just like a company, Company borrows money to invest in the company. If the company grows faster, then the investment pays for itself. And that can be true also for government investment, whether it's hard investment like infrastructure or social type infrastructure, such as childcare. Boosting labor force participation, I think, would be a really important ingredient to the long-term growth trend for Canada. And that would help initiatives like that to pay for themselves.
Is that kind of approach, though, and that long-term view, is that going to leave a lot of the repaying to be done by our kids, though? There's some are making reference to intergenerational equity issues on a number of policy fronts. Public debt is just one of them, and a concern that personally I think needs to be explored more deeply and some dots connected. But in public finances in particular, are we not leaving a good portion of the cost of filling that crater as we had to? You argue very persuasively. Are we not leaving a lot of costs of what we had to do today and in the last 8 months for our kids to pay off? I'm pretty sure you're not going to give me any assurance that the bank's policy rate is going to be 0.25% when my teenager is my age, in a little while from now.
Well, no, but I think that real interest rates are driven primarily by demographics, underlying demographics, and I would say that during the 70s and 80s we had an anomalous period of high interest rates, both because of a population labor force boom, which came after the Second World War, and because of an inflation outbreak in the 1970s. I'm not predicting either of those things to happen in the years ahead. And therefore, I conclude that real equilibrium interest rates, or R star if you like, are likely to be quite low, not as low as they are today, but very low by historical standards, at least our lifetime, for a generation. So I do think that it's quite feasible for Canada and other countries to grow faster than that, and thereby eat into that debt. So those of us who were born in the 1950s, part of the baby boom cohort, we were born into a world that had more than 100% of GDP in outstanding debt, just like we're verging on today, according to the IMF's latest publications last week. And so I don't think of myself as having carried a burden to pay for the debt that was incurred during the Second World War. Economic growth ate that debt away, and I think that's quite possible for us to do the same thing if we're smart about it. It won't be quite as easy, perhaps, because we won't have the population growth that we had then, but still, I think it's an important argument to bear in mind. And again, visualize the counterfactual. And I would remind you, too, that the last thing we'd want to do is leave our kids with zero or crumbling infrastructure. And that's really what happened from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. Well, actually a little longer than that, say until late 2000, up towards 2010. From the mid-90s till then, those 15 years, we invested almost nothing in infrastructure because that was years of austerity for reasons that you mentioned in the paper by Governor Dodge. And so that was one of the consequences, less infrastructure spending. But I think today we're in a position where we can do that infrastructure investment and be confident that if we choose wisely, it will contribute to growth in the future and help us pay for the investments we're making.
Now, some are arguing that we can make all of those investments, social, economic, infrastructure, all sorts, even more easily than that. Have you heard of this thing called modern monetary theory, MMT? And have you considered trying it?
Well, yes, I have heard of MMT, or modern monetary theory, which is not modern, because it was well fleshed out actually by Keynes back in the 1930s. It's not monetary, actually, it's fiscal. So it's about fiscal policy. And it's not actually a theory, it's more like an accounting set of accounting principles. But that's just a little bit of quibbling. I mean, the essence of it is that the debt doesn't matter because we can't go bankrupt because we can always print money to cover our bills if we're a sovereign nation with our own currency, which of course we are. The caveat is that we need to stop or restrain ourselves from doing so to excess, and excess is contemplated as rising inflation. So since central banks actually create money in exactly the way described in that theory every day, or at least every week, I would suggest that they've been creating exactly the right amount of money every year for 25 years to achieve around 2% inflation here in Canada. And so there's no free lunch available to suddenly do way more. But today, of course, we are doing way more on every front because of the crater I talked about. And so there's no concern about causing inflation by having a really expansionary fiscal policy today when the economy is as weak as it is. Well, in that situation, we knew from Keynes that that's exactly the prescription. And so I'm sorry, I'm not a subscriber to MMT. It's just not actually new. We're doing the same thing. And by the way, the last time we actually experimented with MMT was in financing the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. And as it turned out badly. That caused the great inflation of the 1970s, which went global after the Bretton Woods system exploded as one of the consequences. So again, I'm not much of a fan of that.
Yeah, I didn't think you were going to bite on that one.